I'm Ronna Berger. I'm chair of the philosophy department and director of the Judeo-Christian Studies lecture series. And tonight we have the Kathleen and John Bricker Memorial Lecture. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all and to introduce our speaker. Calum Carmichael is professor of comparative literature and adjunct professor of law at Cornell University. He has degrees in science, historical theology, and law from the Universities of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Oxford. And he's received many prestigious fellowships, including the Guggenheim and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Professor Carmichael has been at Cornell since he began teaching, and he's the recipient of a Distinguished Teaching Award there. Professor Carmichael is the author of 11 books that focus primarily on biblical law. The newest one about to appear any day now, I think, on the Book of Numbers, and editor of 5 volumes on different aspects of law and literature. I first met Calum at a small conference and was immediately fascinated by his approach to the Bible through a very special way of linking the legal material with the narratives, which you'll have a chance to see in just a moment. We also owe to Professor Carmichael a 6-volume series devoted to the work of David Daube, the scholar of ancient law who was his mentor. Daube was actually one of the earliest guest speakers in Tulane's Judeo-Christian lecture series. He came in 1982 and gave a talk on the Old Testament and the New. I met him on that occasion, and I'm so pleased to have Calum Carmichael here tonight carrying on that tradition. I was going to end by mentioning Calum's greatly appreciated role as a tutor of bagpipe playing, but now I've learned one last honor. He is the reigning Gulf champion of the island of Barra in the Outer Hebrides, a permanent title, as he explains quite modestly, because the sheep and cows ruined the course a few months after he won. Please welcome Calum Carmichael.
First of all, let me thank the program in Judeo-Christian Studies for inviting me this evening. And of course, I wish to thank Ronna Berger, whose distinguished scholarship and marvelous conversational skills are admired by so many, and certainly by this person. She also has a talent, as you probably know, for organization. And there is a natural law which says that the administration is always wrong, but Ronna has given me cause for skepticism. I still believe it, but I thank her for introducing that element of skepticism. I'll be talking about the Joseph story in the book of Genesis, and I want to highlight, to begin with, 2 rules. One of them is very familiar in its abbreviated form, expressed in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel. It says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The other rule you will probably not be familiar with. It is about deceiving, dissembling in a transaction, and there is good reason not to know it well. Down the centuries, it has proved to be one of the most difficult rules to interpret. Let me comment first about the love of neighbor rule. I confess I have difficulty in comprehending its meaning. If it had read, "You shall be kind to a neighbor," then I would have little problem, except I would want to know what prompted such a straightforward moral injunction. But to love, yes, the emotion of love, a neighbor, rather than to tolerate or reach out or some milder emotion, is odd. The requirement to love the neighbor as one loves oneself just adds to the bewilderment. I can't imagine that back in the biblical period, the author of the injunction would have in mind some notion of self-esteem, although it is common these days to read the rule this way. A typical contemporary comment on its appearance in the parable of the Good Samaritan, a comment is, quote, "One is to have the same esteem and care for a neighbor that one would have for oneself." The notion of self-esteem, I'm afraid, is a product of the therapy culture of recent times, but not one to be attributed to such an ancient source, such as we find in New Testament material. There is a problem also when we go back in time to the original formulation of the rule in Leviticus. There it says, "You shall not avenge nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor who is like yourself." Why would one counsel someone to counter the emotion of vengeance and the bearing of a grudge with the raw emotion of love? As a piece of moral advice, the injunction seems quite unrealistic, especially if you're brought up in Scotland as I was, where you mustn't show your emotions, and you're brought up from an early age with such folk songs about the Scottish husband who was so in love with his wife that he almost told her. The rule becomes transparent when we consider how ancient lawmakers typically formulate legal or ethical rules. In the earliest sources of law, of which the Bible is one, the lawgiver's inclination is to focus on a specific case and to formulate a rule in response to it. The lawmaker avoids articulating a larger principle that might cover a number of cases. Rather, he goes from case to case and records his differing judgments. What then is the case that the lawgiver in the book of Leviticus scrutinizes in his rule about replacing vengeance with love? The case comes directly, I submit, from the Joseph story. The situation under scrutiny in the rule is a climactic development in the story. The relationship between the brothers and Joseph is one in which the emotions of hatred and love are entangled, but in the end, love trumps the hatred. The initial part of the rule focuses on how Joseph exercises a grudge and pays back his brothers for their evil treatment of him. When the brothers come to Egypt to buy food to relieve the famine back in their own country of Canaan, they do not recognize Joseph, who is now governor in Egypt. Joseph, bearing a grudge and taking vengeance, puts his brothers through experiences that replicates the hateful act that they had perpetrated against him. Let me cite these experiences. The brothers had concealed the true nature of Joseph's fate by having their father believe what his eyes told him, namely, that Joseph's blood-stained coat signified that he had been killed by a wild beast. Joseph, in turn, accuses the brothers of offending with their eyes, saying that they are spies who have come to view, literally, the nakedness of the land. Again, the 10 brothers caused their father grief over the loss of his favored younger son, Joseph. This son, Joseph, now causes them anguish by insisting that they bring the remaining younger son, Benjamin, to Egypt. By pressuring them to do so, the brothers will burden themselves by again causing their father great pain. Yet again, the brothers sought, but did not in fact receive money for selling Joseph as a slave. He now trips them up by the use of money. He torments them by surreptitiously slipping money into their sacks of grain after they have already paid for it. The money represents the payment they had never received for trying to sell him. In these differing ways, Joseph keeps alive the memory of the brothers' offense against him, and in doing so, clearly exhibits a vengeful attitude. Vengeance, however, is not the only emotion at work in the story. While Joseph certainly pursues grudges against his brothers, affection for them wells up in him also. When the brothers, in the presence of the disguised Joseph, interpret what is happening to them in Egypt as retribution for what they had done to him, Joseph turns aside and weeps. Later, when Benjamin comes to Egypt, Joseph, quote, yearned upon his brother, and he sought where to weep, and he entered into his chamber and wept there. When climactically Joseph reveals his true identity to his brothers, quote, he wept aloud and kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. Tied in with Joseph's vengeful hounding of his brothers is his genuine affection for them. He is one of them, intimately bound as a member of the same family. In this narrative about hatred within the first family of Jacob, Israel, Joseph is portrayed as wanting nothing more than to be part of it. Feelings are very much on display. The narrative is about vengeance and affection, the same striking combination of emotions in the law. In light of the rule's background inspiration, the reference to the emotion of love in the rule should not be toned down. In most situations, it is not realistic to counsel against vengeance by requiring that love be put in its place. The situation within Joseph's family, however, presents precisely this coming together of the two contrary feelings. Why does the rule speak of loving a neighbor who is an Israelite like oneself? Well, Joseph becomes an Egyptian, marries an Egyptian woman, has children by her, and dresses as an Egyptian. He is so Egyptian, in fact, that he cannot even sit down at a meal with his visiting brothers because of the food rules observed by the Egyptians. Yet, when the brothers turned up in Egypt from the neighboring country of Canaan, Joseph instinctively feels kinship with these neighbors. In being overcome with affection, he recognizes how powerful is the tie that binds him to them, despite what they did to him. Not only does Joseph wish to restore fraternal relations, but he will also go on to insist that they bury him with his and their forefathers. Love of his brothers in place of the grudges he'd held against them leads him to shed his Egyptian identity for his previous one and to renew the bond with his fellow countrymen. In a foreign land, Joseph's brothers are Israelites like him, Joseph an Israelite like them. Hence the notion in the rule of a neighbor being like oneself, namely an Israelite. Let me turn to the second rule about dissembling in a transaction that is proved impossible to interpret as a coherent whole. Detailed reflection on Joseph's conduct is again the clue to its meaning. Previous interpreters have not been alert to the integral link that exists between biblical narrative and the laws that are part of the storyline. Like traditional interpreters, today's scholars have also understood the rule as dealing with deception in the economic life of the lawgiver's time. But the rule can only be understood, I submit, by seeing it as commentary on Joseph's conduct. You have the text on the handout. I'll read it. If a person sin and commit a trespass against Yahweh, God, by dissembling to his compatriot in the matter of a deposit or, and this expression is unique, or placement of a hand, or robbery, or has oppressed his compatriot, or found something lost and dissembles about it, and swears falsely in any one of all these that the person might have done, sinning therein, then it shall be, if he has sinned and is guilty, he shall restore that which he robbed, or what he gained from his oppressive act, or the deposit that was deposited with him, or the lost thing that he found. In any one matter about which he has sworn falsely, he shall even restore it, and shall add the fifth part more thereto, and give it to the aggrieved party in the day of his trespass offering. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the sanctuary, the priest shall make atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. The rule is a specific response to Joseph's tripping up his brothers when they come to Egypt to purchase grain. The money they hand over to pay for the grain, Joseph's steward secretly deposits into their sacks before they set off to return home. After the money is discovered, the brothers eventually bring it back to Egypt, but they do so with much trepidation. When they seek to hand it over, Joseph's steward dissembles by stating that God must have put the money in their sacks. Once we see the rule as a response to this incident, long recognized problems in translating some of the words in the law and understanding the coherence of the list of seemingly unrelated misdeeds in it become soluble. In the story, Joseph has already tormented his brothers by taking one of them hostage, Simeon. Joseph's aim is to use Simeon to pressure the brothers into bringing Benjamin down to Egypt. On their journey back to Canaan, the brothers come upon the hidden money, and the discovery causes them consternation. Jacob, too, when he learns about the development, is greatly perplexed and worried. With the utmost reluctance, Jacob, the father, permits Benjamin to accompany the brothers back to Egypt. The aim is to have Simeon released and to purchase more grain. Jacob also has them take double or perhaps triple the money they paid the first time, and he says to them, "May God Almighty give you mercy before the man, that he may send away your other brother and Benjamin." Jacob fears that, like Simeon and Joseph before him, Benjamin will not return. In the Leviticus rule, the word pikadon, deposit, refers to the money Joseph has his steward slip into the brothers' sacks of grain. The term is found only one other time in biblical sources, when it refers to the deposited grain that Joseph set aside from the 7 years of plentiful harvests to provide relief from pending starvation. It is from this laid-aside grain that the brothers receive their allotment. The term, as used in the rule, refers to the money the brothers paid and which was deceptively returned to their sacks. Although critics note in passing that the term pikadon, deposit, only occurs in the Joseph story and in the Leviticus rule, they have made nothing of the underlying ideas that link the double usage. They have chosen to read the term as referring not to a deposit that the recipient is deceived about, but to a deposit whereby a person commits to someone an object for safekeeping, and the recipient is the deceiver. All interpretations of the rule view the deception as committed by a custodian. It is this error that has prevented interpreters from seeing any connection with Joseph's shenanigans. From the point of view of the Leviticus lawmaker, the wrong under review is done to, not by, the brothers. They are the ones subject to the deception, and the steward, and ultimately Joseph, are the deceivers. The next term in the rule about a deceptive act, in Hebrew, tisumet yad, literally means the putting of a hand, the placement of a hand. Its meaning is decisive for my interpretation. The expression occurs nowhere else. Translators try various meanings: a pledge, an investment, a contract. The reference, I submit, is also to the deception about the money put back in the brothers' sacks of grain. A simple act of buying grain for money became a complicated transaction because of the placement of the money in the sacks. After returning to Egypt with the money, the brothers, in much fear, say to Joseph's steward, "We cannot tell who put," Hebrew sum, "we cannot tell who put our money in our sacks." And they add, we have brought other money down in our hand, Hebrew yad. In the rule, the placement, sum, of the hand, yad, conveys the deception of depositing the money in the sacks of grain by the hand of the steward. When the rule proceeds to cite its central concern, how the person swears falsely in the matter, it is referring to the steward's declaration. "Fear not," he says, "your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. Your money came to me." The steward deviously attributes the placement of money in the sacks to God instead of acknowledging his own act. The false swearing adds to the wrongful action. It has nothing to do, as is commonly argued, with defendants in a court of law denying under oath what they have done with a deposit in their safekeeping. It is not necessary to introduce the notion of a court of law at all to understand this offense of false swearing. The rule next refers to a deception to do with robbery. The reference takes up from the story when the returning brothers meet Joseph and are welcomed into Joseph's house. They are suspicious, however, and fear that they will receive not hospitality, but rough treatment, enslavement, and seizure of their donkeys. As they saw it, the invitation was a trap. Quote, "And the men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house. And they said, 'Because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time, are we brought in, that he may seek occasion against us and fall upon us and take us for bondmen and our asses.' If that fate had befallen them, it would have been an act of pillage against these foreigners." The rule in Leviticus refers to gazelle, robbery, a term used precisely for this kind of action. By the way, in assessing their fear of being made bondmen by Joseph, we should recall that these are the brothers who would have sold Joseph as a bondman. The next deception in the rule after robbery, directed against one's fellow or kinsman, Hebrew amit, is about an act of withholding under the guise of the law. The term ashart, to extort, to oppress, can refer to acts of withholding, ostensibly for lawful reasons, something or someone, land, farm animals, and persons. The reference is to the detention of Simeon in Egypt on the trumped-up charge of spying, which resulted in his being withheld from his family. The term amit, fellow, or kinsman can refer to a close family member. Simeon is handed back to his brothers at the point when the steward receives them at Joseph's house. The two developments, potential robbery and hostage-taking in the same context, make clear why the lawgiver couples the two offenses in the Leviticus rule. The final deception in the rule concerns something that has been lost. It is turned up, but there is dissembling at its discovery. From the brothers' perspective, the steward had somehow lost the money, and it had mysteriously turned up in their possession. At this point in the saga, the brothers prepare to hand the money over to the steward, but he intervenes and says that he received their money. The steward is dissembling, and the deception turns on his pressing over literal meaning. He did receive the money, but unknown to them, he soon returned it to their sacks. The dissembling is reminiscent of those dodges in law where there is a fiddling with time. A contemporary example is where a man marries a woman, or vice versa, for a brief period, solely that she might obtain an immigrant visa. The institution of marriage is perverted from its orderly function by substituting the vanishing for the enduring. In sum, the actions in the rule are detailed and various, but they are connected. Each offense, enumerated in Leviticus, relates back to a specific incident in the Joseph story, to the series of dealings surrounding the brothers' purchase of grain. The rule, in consequence, displays a coherent character that has otherwise proved impossible to detect. My reading differs in a major way from other interpretations. Aside from the fundamental error about who is the one deceiving in regard to a deposit, these interpretations all rely on reading the rule as reflecting problems in the society of the lawgiver's time. We are told that the writers responsible for Leviticus, quote, appropriated into their collections numerous norms associated with the social aspects of life. One commentator asks why there is no mention of other wrongs, such as bodily harm, violations against marriage and family order, or legal misrepresentation. And he suggests that the wrongs cited in the rule are but a selection from a longer list of possible offenses. If, however, we observe that the details of the rule follow closely the details in the Joseph story, such claims are unnecessary. The calculation of compensation in the rule for the party tricked in a transaction also reflects back on the story. From the lawgiver's viewpoint, it is the brothers who are wronged. In the story, as it turns out, they are also compensated. The focus falls on the money deposited in the brothers' sacks. They have restored to them the wrongfully withheld Simeon and the donkeys they worried might be taken by an act of robbery. The money, too, remains with them. How exactly are the brothers compensated in the story? Initially, Jacob and his sons sought to hand back to Joseph the money they had found in their sacks. Jacob hoped that the Egyptian official had erred and that he would reaccept the money. The fear was that the brothers might be accused of theft and that there would be a negative consequence. They were prepared for that eventuality and intended to restore the grain's value in money, plus perhaps another equivalent amount if a verse in Genesis 43 refers to a triple amount taken to Egypt. In the end, the grain costs them nothing. For the lawgiver, it was Joseph who had been up to no good in having the money secretly deposited in the sacks. It is he upon whom blame falls. The lawgiver's judgment is that the money used in the deception was rightly never handed back to Joseph. After the brothers tried to pay, Joseph's steward refused to take it. He let them keep it, perversely by way of a gift. The rule's focus is on who is the rightful possessor of the deposited money at the point in time when the brothers attempt to pay it back. The steward declined the money by telling them that God must have given them treasure in their sacks. The brothers are compensated in effect by having received an allotment of grain for free. The lawgiver formulates a rule that articulates the implicit compensation in the story. Restitution to the victim of the payment for the grain, as well as an additional 20% measure on account of the dishonest act of deposit. In the rule, then, not only has the deceiver to restore what has been deposited, but he has to pay an additional 20% fine. How has this fraction been arrived at? During Joseph's governance of Egypt, and after the famine was over, an Egyptian serf received a free allotment of seed, and once harvested, he had to pay to the overlord 1/5 of the grain, 20%. Joseph himself had instituted the policy. Just so, if the rule in Leviticus is primarily focused on the grain the brothers had paid money for, the judgment on their case is similar. In light of the dishonesty when the allotment of grain was made to the brothers, the money they paid for it has to turn into a gift and an extra fifth part, 20%, added to the original amount. As happened in the narrative, the grain constitutes a gift, with one difference, that the extra payment of 20% goes to the recipient of the grain and not to the provider. In addition to material restitution for the victim of deception, the rule also requires a sanctuary offering. It has to be a certain kind of offering, what we call a trespass offering, Hebrew asham. Why? Because the divine name was used in the story to perpetuate a deception. We recall how after returning to Egypt, the brothers in much fear say to Joseph's steward, "We cannot tell who put our money in our sacks." And the steward replies, "Fear not, your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. Your money came to me." It is a false declaration in God's name. The Joseph story is usually viewed by scholars as having little or no relation to the rest of the Bible, never mind to the rules in Leviticus. The saga is seen to stand out as an isolated composition. One scholar speaks of the, quote, virtually complete silence of the rest of Scripture on the subject of the Joseph story. The romanticized hero of the story almost never appears elsewhere in the Old Testament, outside Genesis and the first chapter of Exodus. Another scholar finds it astonishing that Joseph enjoyed great popularity among later Jewish interpreters in contrast to, quote, the rather insignificant role which Joseph plays in the shaping of Israelite religion. Another scholar recently comments about Joseph's conduct, how, quote, he eschews revenge and hatred, he avoids revenge and hatred, and how his virtue is supreme. He says of Joseph's intrigue with the brothers' grain sacks that, quote, if Joseph does arrange things so as to give his brothers a scare or two along the way, well, a reader most likely feels that this is only justified in view of their earlier misconduct. Such comments are misguided. I find that a very considerable number of biblical rules judge issues in this very story. Many, moreover, are negative about Joseph's conduct. The Joseph story shows up repeatedly in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sources, as well as in later literary sources. Joseph is always treated as a hero, a model of piety and virtue. What accounts for such a gulf between the later wholly positive evaluation of the figure of Joseph and the sharply critical one that emerges in the biblical legal sources? A universal phenomenon is at work. The capacity to hold together admiration of excellence and admission of failings is rare in general. Doubly so for someone who enjoys elevated status. Triply so where the assessment passes through the hands of successive, ever more devout cultivators of tradition. Let me conclude by circling back to the topic I began with and ask why in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke's Gospel we find the abbreviated form of the rule, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The parable is given by Jesus in the context of a conversation with a lawyer about the two fundamental commandments, love of God and love of neighbor. The discussion is primarily concerned with how to interpret Torah, the law. The lawyer asks who his neighbor is. Jesus responds with a story about the man who goes from Jerusalem to Jericho and encounters thieves. They strip him of his raiment, wound him, and leave him half dead. By chance, there happens to pass a certain priest, but he looks away and walks on. A passing Levite does the same. A certain Samaritan, however, stops, binds up the man's wounds, and takes him on his beast to an inn in Jericho. In answer to Jesus' question as to which of the three acted as neighbor to the victim, the lawyer says, he that showed compassion to him. Jesus tells him to do likewise. Once we relate the original formulation of the rule in Leviticus to the Joseph story, as I've argued this evening, we find that the parable turns out to be an updated version of that story, and the telling of it as an explanation of who is one's neighbor makes sense. The Samaritans traced their origin to Joseph. Indeed, sometimes in the sources, for example in biblical texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls, a mention of Joseph is a veiled reference to the Samaritans. In the parable, the victim of the attack experiences what Joseph experienced at the hands of his brothers. Each was assaulted in inhospitable terrain, each stripped of his coat, and each would have died if no one had intervened. Joseph's brothers callously pay no heed to his calls for help. One of these brothers is Levi. In the parable, a priest and a Levi, who both descend from Levi and who represent the temple service, ignore the victim's fate. The priest and the Levite are singled out in the parable because of the tension at the time between Samaritans and Jews. The mutual hostility of these brother Israelites centered on their deeply conflicting views about the proper site of the temple. For the Jews, it was Jerusalem, but for the Samaritans, it was Mount Gerizim. The antagonism is expressed when, just before Jesus tells the parable, he and his disciples pass through a Samaritan village, but the local population refuses them hospitality. Why? Because, quote, his face was set toward Jerusalem. That is, to the place of a temple repellent to Samaritans. The intergroup conflict between the Samaritans and the Jews is a contemporary version of the intergroup conflict between their ancestors, Joseph and his brothers. To turn back to the Genesis saga for a moment, recall that Joseph, the first Samaritan, eventually becomes the rescuer of his brothers when in Egypt they themselves face circumstances similar to what Joseph had experienced at their hands. Like Joseph when he was a victim, the brothers were treated by Joseph as persons with no identity in a foreign land, indeed in the spying incident as captive slaves. The parable updates the Genesis story. In helping the wounded man, the Samaritan identifies the victim the Samaritan identifies the victim with his ancestor Joseph in the pit. The Levite and the priest stand for the brothers of Joseph who disregard his plight. But because the Samaritan responds to the needs of someone in dire straits, the Samaritan also stands for the transformed Joseph when he acted as rescuer of his brothers. The Samaritan thus provides the paradigm of a son of Jacob, an Israelite, who in a most precise way loves his neighbor as himself. Luke's use of the abbreviated form of the original Leviticus rule becomes intelligible. Jesus knew that the rule about the love of neighbor issued from the Joseph story. His aim in telling the parable is not, as commonly thought, to affirm an ethic of universal love. His focus is more parochial. It is to encourage the Samaritan and Jewish factions to embrace the forgiveness and reconciliation at the climax of the Joseph story, that they should love the other because they are brother Israelites. Thank you.
This was a very fascinating lecture. I'm not really sure that all of the features of the second rule are in the Joseph story. Finding something lost and dissembling about it. Well, Joseph does dissemble about the money, but he doesn't really find anything lost. Does he?
Speak more slowly, Joseph. What?
He does dissemble about the money in the sacks.
Yes, yes.
But he doesn't really find anything lost, does he?
He doesn't find?
The money is not lost from his perspective. He knows where it is.
Yes, he does, yes.
So why would the rule for finding something lost?
Because from the brother's point of view and the father, when they find it, they think that the steward must have lost it in some way, somehow. It turned up mysteriously in their sacks of grain. That's why they're so fearful. And therefore, when they take the money back, they're bringing back money that they think the steward, some way, somehow, misplaced in the brother's sacks. So from that point of view, as the brothers see it, from the point of view of the steward, the money has been lost, and lo and behold, here it is, and they're now giving it to the steward. That strikes me as, from their point of view, emphasis their point of view, that the money from the steward's stance has been lost. And they find it in their sacks. They don't know where it's come from. They don't know that the steward had playing get right. Sorry?
Being done by different people.
What was that? I didn't hear that.
The finding and the dissembling them are being done by different people, according to your view.
No. Well, the steward, of course, is acting as an agent on behalf of his master, Joseph. But agency, the messenger of a man is the man. So it's the steward acting on behalf of Joseph. The brothers are not dissembling at all. They genuinely think that the money in the sacks belongs to the steward. They just don't know how on earth it got there.
So the brothers think the steward lost the money. So the steward lost the money.
That the steward just won't know where the money is, and lo and behold, they found it in their sacks, and they better return it because they've got to get more grain. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about the connection between Joseph and the Samaritans?
Yeah.
That's something I hadn't heard before.
That's standard in rabbinic sources and Dead Sea Scrolls and intertestamental sources, that the Samaritans trace their ancestry to especially Ephraim, and therefore to Joseph. So that's par for the course. And the Ephraim became synonymous for the northern kingdom of Israel, and there were ones who were taken by the Assyrians in 722, and sent into exile, and then they came back, and the Judeans, where one can properly use the term Jewish now, regarded them as tainted by their Assyrian experience, foreign marriages, and also the Samaritans only regarded the temple, the interpretation in the book of Deuteronomy that the temple had to be built in Mount Gerizim near present-day Nablus. And remember, the Samaritans regarded only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, as authoritative. To this day, they still regard it as the authoritative body of law. And that's why the lawyer, genuinely discussing interpreting the law,